VA, which stands for Hire Your Virtual Assistant. And I am excited today because, everyone who gets into the whole idea of trying to outsource, time-consuming work that they have to people in foreign countries, you're going to always run into this issue of, culture, because, there might be cultural differences that, you might not understand. And I figured, let me get someone who really understand this this whole process of, how the cultural differences that, occur in different countries, especially when you're trying to outsource to them. And today I have Brandy Moore from IndiaThink.com. So go ahead, Brandy, introduce yourself to the audience and let's get started.
Hi, Owen. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm Brandy Moore, and I guess the best way to describe me is that I'm an India business culture expert. And I also am very focused on the rest of the BRIC countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And the way I think about the world is, how can we work together? And that becomes extremely important as globalization really is with us. And we're all working together now, but we're all very different. So my business model is based on how can we think about each other and then try to adapt the way that we just interact inside the workplace. Decisions, how do we manage a team, how do we manage time, and I hope we can talk about all that stuff today.
Definitely. And just so the audience understands, even though you have this core focus in India and the culture in India, you still have the ability to share with us information about, if you're trying to outsource to Philippines, Brazil, and all these other countries. Our core focus today is really how to relate with the culture of these different people in these different countries and how to use that to your benefit when it comes to working with them. So before we get started, I always want to get the audience to know a little bit more about the person they're listening to. So tell us, how did India Think got started?
Actually, it started because I was working at America Online, which is now called AOL. And at that time, AOL was growing like crazy. We had about 35 million members, and they wanted to be bigger. So they said, we have to go to Europe. So I ended up going to Europe, the UK, a few countries in the EU to negotiate all these different contracts, privacy issues. My background's actually in information security, if you can believe it. And I'm formally trained in forensic science. So my focus at that time was, okay, I have to work with all these Europeans, and it was really apparent right from the get-go that everybody had different thinking at the table when we would look at contracts or try to get an agreement. I was successful, but during that time I started studying cultures, and there's a few scientists actually that are Dutch that have spent their whole life trying to figure out how can we measure cultures so when we interact with each other we can do better. And after my success in Europe, I actually was sent to India, and it was not a great trip. I don't think anybody really prepared me for what India had to offer in terms of the complexity of trying to get things done. And that problem existed inside some of the world's largest outsourcers, inside the location that we wholly owned inside India, and it was really a challenge. So that was back in the early 2000s, and since that time I have just been focusing on how can we understand cultures, but really more importantly, how can you work? How can you get stuff done? Because you don't have enough time to be a cultural master. Yeah. But if you just consider a few things, then it's a lot easier to get stuff done.
Definitely. So, the entrepreneur listening to this so far has been, understands, your background. And now the thing is, knowing that there's cultural differences, especially if you're outsourcing to different parts of the world. So, first of all, what are those issues that you think entrepreneurs have to be aware of when it comes to culture in the first place?
Well, I think there's a few. Probably the most common issues I see are related to thinking about how to manage people. So how are you going to manage that, quote-unquote employee that you've hired on in a way that's going to get the results that you're looking for? The other thing is realizing that the time difference is immense. And even though that's not cultural, if you don't have the right things in place, you can really, really fall down if you don't have some kind of structure around your relationship. I will say that, as a side note here, one of the most exciting things that's happening for entrepreneurs right now is that they have access to really really top-notch talent in these emerging markets because of the way that the world is changing. A lot of that talent is deciding to work for themselves, and this is a huge frustration for companies that are trying to hire that talent. So it's a great opportunity to try to leverage emerging markets' cheaper labor forces. Some other things to consider, sorry for the tangent, are, you know, in the United States specifically, we're much more focused on getting things done rather than a relationship. Yeah. So we don't spend a lot of time interacting, getting to know people. And finally, you know, a lot of times the idea of working for somebody, like what's in it for me, is just a little bit different in some of these countries. So I think there's a lot of things that come to the table, but perhaps like an easier way to think about it would be maybe some best practices.
Okay.
I think that would be a great thing to talk about.
And I'd love to go into that because we want to learn what will be, in your view, the best practices that you know, entrepreneurs need to pay attention to in regards to the cultural differences in different countries.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to get started. So let's talk about best practices. Now, the thing that I see most often with entrepreneurs is that we don't have a lot of time. I'm an entrepreneur myself, so you don't have a lot of time, and you just want to get things done. And oftentimes, when you're outsourcing, for lack of a better word, because that's what this is, something, you don't take enough pre-planning time yourself to figure out what really needs to get done. And because you don't do that, a lot of things happen. The first thing that happens is the person that you've sent the project to in the emerging economy may not have the same skill set that you do, may not have the cultural context that you do. So there's things that we just take for granted. A great example is in the United States, all the time we say just-on-time delivery. That concept doesn't really exist in other nations. So it's important to think a little bit about what is the background this person I'm hiring needs to know. And you need to spend a little bit of time just giving them the story. It's so powerful to give someone your story. The second problem I see around this planning component is...
Real quick, when you say give them the story, is that the story as to the history of what what you've accomplished with the company so far, or the history or the story behind the task itself? I'm trying to dive into that more.
For example, if you are, let's say you've asked someone to make a website for you. It's going to be really important that even though that website designer that you've hired in that other country, let's say it's India, may have an extremely verbose set of skills technically. They may know nothing about the websites that you like, the websites that your customers like, what's really important to your customers. So they may just go along with the design thinking that something's completely different from your customers. And I think one of the challenges for an entrepreneur is that you do end up hiring, essentially, these people are experts. These assistants a lot of times have so much expertise. So you have to be a little bit more assertive about what you want so they can offer you their expertise and you can get out of it what you need as well. So you don't kind of get sidelined and not get back what you need. So that's a good example of what is the big picture of this. It might be helpful, too, in that particular situation to say, where do I want this to be? Where do I want this to go? Not just a simple, small project.
Okay.
I think so let's talk, going back to thinking about a project. The next problem I see is that people, because they don't spend a little bit more time planning, they don't have a way to check on what's happening. So we have these immense time zones. I mean, I'm in New York when I'm at home. So from New York to China, that is a good 12 time zones. So if you hired someone in China, how are you going to keep track of how things are going? Because if you don't have some kind of check-in on your plan, then you don't know. And the cultural problem that comes into play when you don't have check-ins is that you can email someone and say, how are things going? And a lot of these cultures, India is really notorious for this, they have pleasing behaviors. They want you to be, it's harmony, it's a pursuit of harmony. So they want to tell you, yes, everything's fine. But you also need to realize a lot of these cultures have what I call a culture of inspection. So they expect you to be checking in on what they're doing. They're not going to tell you, no, it's not working. They're going to it's fine.
And I like the fact that you say that too, because I've noticed that with my own experiences. If you try and apply that whole mindset of, oh yeah, in the US they expect you to, just tell you the big picture and just go ahead and start working it. And that one is a little bit different. It's like you need to actually put in several things in place to make sure that each step as you're going, you're verifying the work that gets done. But go ahead. I just wanted to make that point in there.
I think it's great if you verify, because then you don't end up, 3 weeks, 3 months in with something completely different, and that happens a lot. That happens to multi-billion-dollar organizations. So as an entrepreneur, you can do better than them by, being a little bit tighter with your project plan. Another aspect to think about is decisions. So decisions are something we really take for granted when we're entrepreneurs. We're constantly making decisions. And when from like the American perspective, for example, even in Europe, you tend to have organizations where decisions are made like in the middle of the organization. People have a lot of authority. When you enter these emerging markets, even in a small-scale project, there isn't a lot of decision-making authority in the middle of the organization. The top guy is making all the choices. So when you're thinking about just tiny little things in your project, they may not make the decision for you. So, it could be something as I've heard people say, oh my gosh, why couldn't they just decide to put a box around that? It was obvious that was the right choice. But that may not be something that's going to happen. So I think up front, really outlining what is, I want you to be able to make, this level of decision. Go ahead and, agile project methodology, for example, really wants you to rely on trusting the people you're hiring to do work. That same mentality of, go ahead and give it a try, and then I'll check it the next day, and we'll see how it is. That's a great thing to try to encourage. Of course, going back to what I said before, you want to kind of limit the amount of trying out that you're allowing, but I think that will keep you from falling into the time zone trap of the person sends you something, you wake up and you look at it, it's not what you wanted. You wanted to tell them, oh, do this thing that's going to take you 5 minutes, and then what happens, it's a whole nother day. So it's just slowing everything down. There's a lot. I think those are like the top challenges. The other thing I do want to mention, which I just briefly touched on, but I do want to mention that it's really, really important for a lot of the cultures to say yes and instead of no. And that's for a variety of reasons, but a thing to understand when you're engaging somebody in one of these relationships is that they are really, at the end of the day, trying to offer you good customer service by telling you, yes, everything's great. And you always need to check behind that yes.
And so, you mentioned some of the best practices. One of the things I also want to do is see, if there's a way in which we can back that up by showing, examples of maybe people you've worked with or people that who have applied some of this, because stories help to make the point clearer. So, go ahead, if there's any specific examples that you can share with us.
I can give you kind of a more verbose example, because a lot of my clients usually end up being enterprises, so large enterprises.
Okay.
So a good example would be, I had one client had hired a team in India to do some development work. And she was going along, and she kept getting these yes answers back from the team. Oh, yes, everything's fine, and she wasn't checking on it. And 6 months down the road, she had no product. She had nothing to look at, and her boss was like, where's the project? And, when I went back and looked through all of her communication with the team, the thing that was the most interesting about where she went wrong is that the team was telling her no, but they were telling her in a story. So, for example, one of the team members kept writing back, yes, we're working on the project. It has been a very busy month here. We're all preparing for the wedding, and it's going to be next month, and my aunt's very sick, and writing her this very personal story. And what that man in India was trying to tell her is, I'm not working this month because my brother's getting married, and I'm not around. but she was reading this like, this really isn't important information. So that's a good example of like kind of just being a little bit of a decoder when you're going through your project. But that project lost almost $10 million.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I can see that point too. It's just like, she was basically throwing out what she didn't thought was not important to her in the story that was in the response, and not really taking everything all together and really using that as, okay, this is the entire detail. Let me figure out, okay, what is he talking about in regards to this wedding? How is this going to affect my job?
And I think, picking up the phone, just pick up the phone. It's really not expensive in like the lifetime of your work, or even when looking at your project budget. It's really not a big deal to call someone in China and talk to them for 10 minutes, or call someone in Brazil, same thing. I mean, maybe that phone call, in US dollars cost you $10. And it's so worth it at the end of the day to get that personal connect on what's happening.
But yeah, that's a good point. But some people might say, okay, for instance, if you call somebody in India or maybe in China, there might also now be the actual English communication gap. Them not being able to understand you and you not being able to understand them. So how do we bridge that gap?
That's an interesting question. I think that India in particular is usually okay. I see that would be a problem in China. I think that's something that you really need to understand probably before you call them. I hadn't thought about it that way, but I think that you don't want to call someone if they don't speak great English. I think that trying then to really focus on the virtual communication is going to be key. And, I know a lot of people do things for more instant responses, like using Skype and different communication mechanisms like that, and that might be more effective to try to really piece out what's happening. I think the key, though, for most Americans, Western Europeans, our tendency is to not engage as tightly as these other countries do. So we tend to just skim through and not really pick up on all the details until we hear somebody's voice.
Definitely. So I guess the point is really, don't just, I guess that's kind of like when people say delegation versus, what's the word for it? It skips my head. Abdication, where you're basically letting the task go, you're abandoning it for the person, but delegation is really getting involved in all aspects of it, making sure that each part of the process is getting done, and it's really very it's very active, even though in the sense that you're really letting the person handle the work, but you're very actively managing the entire process. So is that kind of the mindset one has to apply when you're working with people from other countries? I
think one of the things we call that here in the U.S. is micromanagement, which is unfortunately a negative term. But when I talk to people about managing these relationships, there's just too large of an opportunity for you not to pick up on anything that you need to. It's so difficult to communicate with somebody that you don't see on a daily basis. Plus, they have a totally different way of thinking about life than you do. That anything you can do to try to bridge that gap is really going to just only make your project work 1,000 times better.
Definitely. What communication tools do you encourage your clients, or even maybe the people who listen to this interview so far, to use to really help to bridge that communication gap?
Yeah, we actually did a big webinar on virtual communication last month, and there's a lot of good tips, which I think will be helpful for your viewers, as well as I can talk briefly to products. But I'd love to give like 2 tips. The first is understanding floor control. So one of the things that we do in the West is we interrupt people and we talk over them. And when you're working with a team that is in another country that does not necessarily have English as a first language, this is really difficult because you don't give a long enough pause for them to jump in. So that's a big thing to consider when you're having this. The second is information in a lot of these cultures is thought of as power. And when you grow up in a culture like that where you don't have access to information, you don't know to ask for it. So a lot of times people just keep working thinking they might need some information, but they don't ask for it. So it's a really good idea up front to really attack, like, listen, if you think you need a piece of information, ask me for it. I will get it for you. You know, you probably do have the right to have access to it. That is a huge thing. So when you think about those two concepts, and then you like bring those over into the phone. So really important on the phone to, for lack of a better word, shut up for a minute. And, you know, and like let the other team understand you're done talking. I always say, just think about it like they're using their computer and like translating everything you're saying and then waiting for you to stop talking to respond. So that's a great thing. The other thing I always say is try to take notes. Both sides need to take notes because a lot of these cultures don't like to take notes. I don't know why. This is a very, very common problem inside India as well as Brazil. I don't know why people don't want to take notes, but it's really good then to exchange at the end. Listen, this is what happened and this is what I need you to do. And you need to follow up on that. I think Skype's a great tool, you know, instant messaging, quick interactions. The one caveat to that is that sometimes those feel really abrupt to a culture that's more into relationship, like the BRIC cultures are. So you may want to, you know, definitely be typing in, hello, how are you? Nice to talk to you today first, if your tendency isn't to do that. And then the last thing I talk about is wikis. And I think wikis are fantastic because it's so great for the person that's working and living in a different time zone than you to be able to access all the information really right at their fingertips. And so if you can figure out a way to get a good system going where people can access the information they need, that's awesome.
So is that kind of like having a project management tool where, you know, as they work, they can go in and see more information. You can go in there and monitor and see what's going on and add in and build upon that. Is that what you're talking about when you say that?
Yes, it could be like some of the tools are like Basecamp. I know
Basecamp.
Yeah, so do I. Use it. It's just, I love that thing. The other thing that I know that a lot of the software development programs, so if you're doing kind of a bigger project where there's maybe like people are putting software into Sandbox, there's also some tools around those things where you can share documentation.
Definitely. And there was one point that you made initially where, you know, an issue with time zone that I wanted to finish, but I didn't really, you know, grab onto that point as much, where you were saying, you know, how to really manage the issue with time. In the sense that, you know, maybe you might send out the work to them, but it might be the next day or that they might be getting into it. So that time zone issue.
Okay. I think one of the, so we know the obvious implications of time zone. And actually, a lot of times we leverage a team. I have a group of people I work with in India, and it's great because they work on stuff while I'm sleeping. It just really accelerates my business. So that's the positive of time zone. The negative is that if the team or the individual that's working with you doesn't have a way to communicate a question, and then it takes you a whole day to respond, and then they didn't quite get your answer, then so now you're 3 or 4 days away from that initial question. So my advice is always, when you start getting maybe, 3 times you're out. If you get an email, you send it back and it comes back a third time with the second question, you need to have a different forum for a conversation. It either needs to be, can we get on Skype if English is an issue, or can we get on a video conference? Because time will slip through your fingers very, very quickly. I wanted to make actually one other cultural note about time, which I think will be of interest. And this is something we're going to do this month for the webinar. There's a cultural factor called time orientation. And it's really important for these relationships because it measures your level of urgency on things. So when you live in a culture that's very focused on time not being wasted, and you can tell if you're in this kind of culture, you can go to the store and see if they have a lot of calendars like they do in the U.S. In the U.S., we really believe that time is money. And the pursuit of just saving time, that doesn't really exist in other cultures, especially in cultures that, like India, where just the idea of life is a life cycle. So it's just going to get done when it's going to get done. There's an ebb and flow to getting things done. It's just not as quick of a pace. So when you're trying to set deadlines with a culture that doesn't necessarily feel the same way about time, it's really a bad idea to set a long deadline that you're not checking on, because they just don't take that end date as seriously, for lack of a better word, as you do. They don't interpret it the same way. That's why I always tell people have some check-ins.
So basically, the whole, even though you have a timeline for a project maybe in the next month, but you want to break it down into mini timelines so that it's really down to, for instance, instead of saying the whole month, you can bring it down to every week. What have you delivered to me, so that it's, bunch of different timelines up to the main goal that you're trying to get to, I guess.
Yes, and it's great because then you know how the person is progressing with the work. You know it's going to get done on time. I know a lot of people that wait until like 3 days before it's supposed to be done, and you have no idea what's going on. You have no idea what's happening with that person you hired. You could have like a total tragic emergency. The risk of doing business, global risk, we've really seen that recently, right, with the problems in Egypt and Japan. So you have no idea. Maybe that person is not even around. It's so great to be checking in consistently so you don't have a heart attack at the end of the month that it's not done.
But that's a good point you make about really diving in and doing as frequent check-in and communication with them as possible. But then there's also this whole, a lot of people get into this whole idea of outsourcing by reading books like The 4-Hour Work Week, by Tim Ferriss, where it's like, it's really more of a thing of getting to the point where you have this news where you're not really doing that much every day, but things are getting done. And now we're talking about the cultural part of it where, you definitely need to dive in, more frequently. How does one bridge those two different constructs?
That's an interesting question. I hadn't really thought about that. I've read most of Tim Ferriss's book, and from what I gathered from the book, the services that he was sourcing were really that ideal, like that I talked about, where you wake up every morning and you get the deliverable. So that might be kind of a way to think about it. You've got a team that is almost reporting to you in a way about what they're up to. I think a lot of what Tim talked about in the book, and you can correct me because I'm not sure if I'm going to remember it correctly, but I think he talked a little bit about having people answer email.
Yeah.
And that is a great example of a repetitive task that you can occasionally be checking in on, and that is working. That's a great example of perfect use for outsourcing, and something that once you get it all set up, you probably don't have to check in on it that often. I would say that when you're doing something more like, developing, or it's brand new, you're creating something, you're creating a new relationship, you've just hired someone new, that's when you need to think about, what are their skill set? We have to make sure they're going to do okay.
And that's a good point you make, because I think that's an easy way to bridge the gap between that that point where Tim Ferriss is making versus the point where we're making right now, where it's basically, if you're working on a process that's already been well outlined, and you've already delivered kind of like, this is how you do it, maybe videos showing how you do it yourself, and you've really systemized the entire process. Initially in the beginning, where they're going to be handling and taking over the process from you, then we now apply this to your own idea, where you really dive in and really try and understand, make sure that they understand what they're doing, and getting the work done, and monitoring them to make sure that they know how to get it done. Eventually, it'll get to a point, because they've been doing the work over a long period of time now, where it's really kind of hands-off, because there is a system in place. I guess, is that the way of bridging those two ideas?
Yeah, exactly. I think that if you have created something where you can systemize it and it's all very well documented, then once you get that team up and running, my advice is to treat them as well as you can and hope that they stay with you and you can just make that work consistently. Long term, anything you do when you hire somebody wherever, it's so ideal if you can create that kind of a relationship. So I think your trust factor, I think that really is trust. I don't know if you agree.
Definitely, it's a trust thing, and even myself, even though I provide people with virtual assistants, you get to a point where you have that trust issue, especially maybe in the beginning of the relationship with the person. So now an entrepreneur listening to this, now we get to the point where we're talking about trust. How can they bridge that gap of trust when you're dealing with people from various cultures?
And I think that's why it's important not to just assume that everything's fine. And I think that trust, when you're working across cultures, comes with performance. Or unfortunately, it really comes from, okay, this team is doing what they said they were going to do, and this is fantastic. And I think that working, especially small entrepreneurs to small entrepreneurs, those entrepreneurs in emerging markets are really want the business that you're giving them, as well as that you'll, refer your friends.
Oh,
so
yeah.
there's a big kind of model there where it's a win-win for everybody if you can get it to work. I think that the complexity of involving all these different cultures is great, but it's definitely an obstacle that can be overcome.
And so with the trust thing really is, even though you say you're trusting, you want to verify every step of the way you're going. So trust but verify is what you're saying.
Yeah, I would say so. Trust but verify, at least for the first couple of projects.
Definitely. Now, so far, I mean, I've really enjoyed the interview, and I always want to try and get, understand every entrepreneur who's on the show. You're busy, you're doing so many different things. Why even take the time to even do this?
To be interviewed?
Yeah, I mean, because I'm curious because we all busy doing different things, but why take your time? We've been in an hour having this conversation. Why do this?
I actually am doing it because I get asked all the time if I should outsource to India, and entrepreneurs ask me that all the time, and I feel a lot of compassion for them because I know that they want to access these different markets and cheaper labor sources, but there's a lot of things to be cautioned about. And I think that everybody wants to jump in, feet first. And so this is kind of an opportunity for me to talk to that community that I obviously adore because I'm part of it, but I don't very often get to work with them because I end up working with organizations. I think that last month, I did a big story for Outsource magazine on how outsourcers manage human capital. And one of the things that two CEOs of huge outsourcing firms that employ like 150,000 people apiece said that they are really challenged by the fact that the brightest people in most of these markets want to work for themselves. And I think that's awesome if entrepreneurs can figure out how to hire them.
Yeah.
You're able to get the talent that, these big giant outsourcers can't hire. I just think that's awesome.
And that's a good point you make too, because now instead of dealing with someone in that culture that wants to just only work for somebody, but you're dealing with someone in that culture who also has that entrepreneurial spirit, and you're trying to figure out, okay, what is that win-win we can work together. And, you're doing something for me that I'm winning, and I'm doing something for you that we're winning. It becomes more of there's more value in that kind of relationship, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just think that there's an amazing opportunity for these different relationships to emerge that just didn't exist 10 years ago. This 10 years ago, we wouldn't even have been really having this conversation.
And we're doing this via Skype. Technology has changed.
Exactly. And isn't that awesome? I just think that's amazing.
Definitely. So, Brandy, before I let you go, how best can any of the my community members listening to this so far, how can they get a hold of you?
Oh, well, you can certainly always email me at brandy@indiathink.com. And I do have a book on this subject. It's called The Little Brick Book, Cracking the Code for global management of projects across Brazil, Russia, India, China. And that's for sale on Amazon. And you know what? It's only 100 pages. So
is there an audio version of the book for people like me that can read? We like to listen to books.
Coming out next week, I hope. And you know, it's funny that we're having this conversation on because I got an email from somebody in India who said, "Hey, I just got your book. It's going to be here in 3 weeks." And I'm like,
wow.
I didn't think about, yeah, I should put my book up as an ebook. Why didn't I do that? Like, of course. But you know what? Maybe we're just all catching up to how quickly the world is moving. So feel free to email me any questions, and I'd be happy to answer them for you.
And I usually always do this at the end of every interview. I always want to, ask a question. Say, if there's anything that, an entrepreneur that's been listening to this so far in regards to and having difficulties with the cultural part of, outsourcing to people from different countries, what is that one word of encouragement that you want to leave with them to, get them moving forward with the process?
I think that the likelihood of misunderstanding is extremely high. And so what I would encourage everyone to not go to the place of, these guys are such idiots. Because most of the time, I have been humbled by some of the places that I've been able to go and work in India, the level of talent that exists there, and have just, there's such a tremendous opportunity to gauge that talent. So beware of just getting angry. Rise above it and try to figure out what's really going on. And I will say there's going to be problems, but you'll get the hang of it. Eventually all of us become global managers one way or the other.
And that point you made is a point that one of my mentors in this outsourcing business made to me previously, where he said, anytime you feel there is a miscommunication and they're not understanding you, realize that you're the one who has the problem. You will not spend the time to really drill down into that thing you're trying to have them do and really explain it to the level where they will understand and get it done. Or it might just be a problem with your system. So anytime there's an issue, look at that as a benefit to saying, okay, let me dive into my system and see how I can improve it.
And I will say, Owen, that's hard to do, but I mean, in terms of like being in the middle of being like, what? But yeah, great tip. Definitely agree with you there.
Thank you very much, Brandy, for doing the interview. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Owen. Have a great day.
You too. So we're done. What do you think?
Awesome.
So welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I really want to know what exactly you think. I mean, if I suck and if I'm not doing a good job, I want to know, because by your input and your comments, your suggestions, your feedback, that's how I'm going to improve on the entire package of what I'm sharing with you. I really want to improve so that you know that your time is well spent when you watch my videos. And if I do good on interviews, and if you like certain things I do, please let me know so I can even improve upon that as well. And I want to thank you really, because your time is well spent, and I mean your time is important to me, and I want to make sure that I continuously put this information in front of you. So I want you to join my community, and in order to do that, you need to click on the link that says get the free ebook, enter in your name and email, and you will receive as a gift from me my free ebook titled The Entrepreneur's Guide to Running a Business in the Cloud. The reason I do that is because I want to share with you that information. You can check it out and make use of it in your business. In the same vein, I will be sending you email updates every time I have new blog posts, as well as if I have new stuff that is not even on the blog, I want to share with you. That way we can stay in contact. One more thing. Before you go, I want to also let you know that if you are really serious about finding, hiring, training, and even working with virtual assistant, if right now you want to get that started, why don't you sign up for my free webinar where I share everything about the entire process. And you can get to do that by clicking on the link on the very top of my blog where it says sign up for the free webinar. Again, thanks for watching the video, and I hope to see you next time.